A very good evening to everyone who's joined us today. My name is Pranati and I work as an associate of Belong Research Collective. And I welcome you all to the fourth day of the inaugural edition of the xSDG UnConference, which is an initiative of Belong. A little bit about Belong. Belong is a social innovation platform that seeks to offer discrimination-free services to people who are otherwise marginalized on the basis of their identity, such as caste, gender, ethnicity, disability, etc. We run programs for three major verticals: the Research Collective, of which this UnConference is a part of, the Mental Health Collective, and Literature Collective. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. Thank you all for joining us for the xSDG UnConference, in which X stands for intersectionality. Essentially, this UnConference is a part of one of our most major initiatives that Belong at the moment, which is called the xSDG, which is a global platform to promote truly intersectional and inclusive development. At xSDG, we've been curating resources in terms of research papers, reports, data sets that are focused on development through the lens of intersectional identity. This UnConference is being held in collaboration with organizations such as Dalberg, JPAL South Asia, and Breakthrough India. It started on the 18th of August and is running up all the way to the 31st of August. And we have a whole bunch of really exciting panels and other interactive sessions to keep you all occupied. So we really hope that you join us for all these sessions that we're curating. If you wish to learn more about these sessions, I will be putting a link to the UnConference website and the registration links in the chat below. And should you have any questions, please feel free to write to us at xsdg@belong.net. Without further ado, I'd now like to hand it over to Anna, who is from the JPAL South Asia team, who will walk us through the details of today's panels and moderate the session going forward. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pranati. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting and moderating this webinar. Hello and welcome to all gathered here. Pranati was very generous in sort of introducing the webinar and the theme of the panel. So I will take a little bit of time to talk about how this panel forms a part of 5 virtual panels that are attempting to identify the gaps in research and policy making in relation to disadvantaged groups, along with proposals to make them more inclusive. JPAL South Asia is hosting this panel alongside Belong, Dalberg, and Breakthrough India, who are co-organizers as part of this event on intersectionality and inclusion. We felt that today's panel was necessary and important and focuses on gender mainstreaming and centering women in policy making, because despite the gains in gender equality and economic development over the last decades, norms and biases continue to constrain human potential, particularly the potential of women around the world. And so there's a pressing need to consider their impacts. One of the important pathways to do this is through gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming outlines a framework for advancing the rights for women and girls and places women at the center of the development agenda, with the goal of transforming discriminatory social institutions, laws, cultural norms, and community practices. So through today's panel, we'll try and understand what the stakeholders from the development spectrum are doing, what more can be done, what are some of the challenges and ways to mitigate them to truly make development more inclusive. To help unpack this, we have 3 fantastic panelists, and I'm really excited to hear from them today. First up, Professor Sima Chandra, who's a professor of economics at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on economic issues in developing countries, including environmental conservation, gender equality, labor markets, health, and education. She serves on the board of directors for JPAL and is the co-chair of JPAL's gender sector. In addition to a host of academic and professional accolades, Sima writes regularly for the New York Times and serves on CARE's board of directors. Welcome, Sima. We're so happy you could join us today.
Thanks, Anna.
We also have Deepta Bhog, who's the head of innovations and partnerships at the Third Eye portal. Many of you may know Deepta's work with Nirantar, where she's the co-founder and as a Center for Gender and Education based out of New Delhi. And her work spans over 3 decades working as a journalist, as a women's rights activist, and so much more. More recently, her research work has focused on women leaders from rural areas and small towns who run non-governmental organizations. And Deepta is also instrumental in initiating Khabar Lahariya, which started as a newspaper in 2002 and today is the country's only women-run brand of digital-first rural news. Welcome, Deepta. We're so excited to hear from you and your vast and rich experience today. Finally, we have Nupur Jhunjhunwala, who leads partnerships for UN Women's India Country Office, where she engages with civil society, government, and private sector organizations to promote gender equality and women empowerment. Nupur has worked in diverse geographies from urban North America to rural Northeastern India and has held positions across the central and state governments, including the ministries of information tech, education, and textiles. Her work has successfully influenced regulation, negotiated financially sustainable multi-stakeholder partnerships, and implemented innovative business models to empower entrepreneurs, many of whom are women. Nupur's work also includes authoring several toolkits and white papers to help build capacities of government officials and field practitioners. And we're very excited to hear from her rich and diverse experience today as well. Welcome, Nupur.
Happy to be here, Anna.
So before I kick off to the panelists with the questions, a quick note to all the attendees here to drop your questions in the Q&A box. We will have a few minutes at the end to take your questions, but I'll also request the speakers to address any that come their way as and when they may want to. Feel free to introduce yourselves or send in your questions anonymously. There are no concerns about that. So I'll first start off by throwing open a question to all the panelists here to understand how gender mainstreaming manifests in your work. We know that it involves integrating a gender perspective at all stages of development, whether it's policy formulation, program design, evaluation, and monitoring. But how does this take shape in your work? And what are some of the challenges and gaps in mainstreaming gender across your particular area of work? So I'd love to start off with you, Nupur.
So Anna, I think gender cuts across all the work we do, of course, being UN Women. But more than that, it's across all segments within the gender we work in the intersectionalities of various aspects of addressing gender equality and women economic empowerment that range from working on livelihoods and income generation to leadership, to ending violence against women, to women in policy making and governance. We work across the spectrum with policymakers, private sector, civil society. In my experience, nobody has cracked the formula to be gender equal under any sector. Everybody's trying pieces, and it's what we're seeing is it's becoming part of the decision-making and the thought process in terms of commitments towards, yes, this is something we now need to start thinking about seriously and start implementing, not necessarily in all aspects do we see it being implemented. Also, initially we saw that gender equality was an afterthought. It almost became that after a policy or a decision was created, it was like, oh, how do I fit the minority group or the gender bit? And, let me put some targets around numbers versus actually doing the mainstreaming and thinking about how do you make that policy relevant to all the stakeholders, whether it's gender, whether it's for accessibility for people with different abilities, whether it's a certain caste, religion, depending on the program that we're working on. So I think it's important, and that's kind of work that UN Women does. We try and work with all our stakeholders across individually as stakeholders and also cross-sectional to see how their pathways cut across each other and across the verticals that I mentioned. And it's a hard job. It's not easy, but it's getting easier because people are more receptive to hearing the need.
Thank you, Nupur. That was really interesting to hear. And I think our takeaway is that, it needs to be a little bit more proactive as opposed to retrospective. And we seem to be making some inroads into this. So I'd love to hear from you, Sima, about how this manifests in the sort of the broader research domain, but also within your work at around gender norms and specifically within the JPAL network.
Sure, thanks very much, Anna. There's a lot to be done, as Nupur was saying, to truly achieve, gender equality and policy accounting for gender fully. So one of the things within JPAL that we're trying to do is just, first of all, with the data, to be systematic about understanding how policies have different effects on girls versus boys or men versus women. And at the diagnosis stage of when understanding problems, to do that gender disaggregation, because my own research is sort of often focused exactly on gender, but there's a lot of other research that isn't, it isn't focused on narrowing gender gaps, but might inadvertently exacerbate them or fortuitously narrow them. And we want to know that because we want to double down on things that have this extra benefit or rework things that have this problem. So I think a nice example is within JPAL, some of the staff and put together what's a sort of a bulletin called Roll Call, which was just looking at education interventions that were aimed at improving kids' education, and they seem to be systematically helping girls. And David Evans at the Center for Global Development and Fei Yuan kind of did a bigger systematic review and found the same thing, that, just for the unfortunate reason that girls are often out of school more, that you can actually just sort of increasing the education budget can help women. And I think there are, kind of cases like that where sometimes we wouldn't have guessed these things. And so within JPAL, at least, we're trying to become systematic about looking at the data to see where there might be some of these surprises. And especially, something might not show up in one setting, but if we can start to collect that data systematically and aggregate it, we can start to see patterns. I think, just as another brief example, like in the conservation world, there's often a pattern where women have worse property rights. They have less secure property rights over their land. And so that has implications because, if they're worried their land is not going to be there, they're not going to be making the long-term decisions that men might have. And so they might not conserve as much, and that's something that we need to think about, property rights for women as a way towards a conservation goal.
Thank you, Sima. We're excited to hear about more of this as we dive deeper into your work. But thank you so much for laying this out. Deepa, I'll turn to you to tell us what the experience has been like in the field, seeing gender programs designed to improve outcomes, how that has manifested from your experience. Has there been an evolution, and to hear from you what the challenges and gaps are?
Thank you. I think in terms of, it's been a very long history, and I'm sort of thinking about the 90s. That's when the term really became very popular, gender mainstreaming. And it's meant different things. I think that we need to think about this term itself. What do we mean by gender mainstreaming? Does the mainstream change or does gender change? That's one big question that is in my mind today. I'm going to broadly draw on my own experience of having worked both in women's development programs in the 90s and intensively having worked in the area of education, whether it was in the Education for All mission, looking at curriculum, creation of knowledge. So those are sort of the spaces from which I'm going to be talking today. And I think the way that I look at gender mainstreaming is about, inserting or installing feminist agendas of equity and equality into legal institutional power structures. That is really what, gender mainstreaming is about, whether it's in government programs, whether it's in development agencies. And I think that what I want to share a little bit is the challenges that I have seen when this process happens in a particular domain. For instance, I want to say that what
is the challenge that happened when gender became part of education in the Indian context, in the Indian education sector, mainstream education. And I think what has happened is that there is a splitting of feminist ideas and gender that has taken place. And feminist ideals with their sort of fraught, contested, subversive, contaminating impacts relating to equality and equity are sort of smoothened out or separated, and gender really becomes part of developmental goals. So there's a splitting of, it emerges from feminist critiques, but there is a splitting that took place, and that took place in the education sector. In particular, I want to highlight that. And how did gender become more hospitable in that context in the 90s and particularly in 2000s, when it became a very core and central idea of the education for all. So gender piggybacks in with the new category in education in the 90s, which is the girl child. The girl child emerges as a very important category while women's empowerment is there, but it really emerges as a very important category in education. And gender enters education through the girl child. And how is it handled? So gender was handled as part of the Millennium Development Goals, more as an add-on, as an isolated category. That's one way in which you make gender more hospitable in sort of, domains of implementation of policies and programs. I'm in particular talking about the Education for All, Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan. And what happened was that it was mostly about women, and there were hierarchies of knowledge that were created. Knowledge production, because education is about knowledge. So what happened was that the disciplines had a certain status, and gender, through its gender experts and trainers who came in, were really part of this very homely world of talking about women and girls and, sort of lower in the hierarchy of knowledge. So you have these implicit hierarchies that develop even in large programs that are really trying. And I think, the Education for All program really did talk about enrollment, completion, lots of girls came in. So I'm not sort of undermining that, but I'm talking about the challenges. And I think even today, gender mainstreaming, really what I see as a challenge is that we continue to be contained within, primarily in developmental discourse, within domains of female mortality, maternal mortality, age of marriage. These are bodies, the body of the woman is still very much central, and fertility are still very central to developmental discourse that is happening around gender and gender mainstreaming. And finally, I want to talk about data, because I think that is really, really important in terms of programs, because the way that data became part of, where you are making interventions at the level of policy and program, it becomes an instrument of not just the planning of identifying the gap, but it actually becomes the instrument of the outcomes. For example, in SSA, the gender gap emerged very, very strongly as a very, very important data gap that was identified through research, through data collection. And yet just fulfilling that gender gap became the outcome itself. So the moment you have reduced the gap, you have dealt with gender equality. Now that is so gender equity becomes a sum of aggregates which are primarily located in quantitative data. And I think that is a challenge we face today as people who are gender mainstreaming. What does data do to the complex realities of women's lives, the complex realities of girls' lives? And when we translate that into data, what happens? So I see those as very, very critical challenges from where I have worked, and that we need to learn from our experience of how gender mainstreaming took place. It had a very important role in bringing lots of girls from marginalized communities and lots of children from marginalized community into the school space. But after that, what? What were the outcomes of that? I don't think we managed to capture it in research and data. Thanks.
Yeah, so if I can, Anna, I'd like to add to Diktaji.
Please.
So now when, UDICE, for example, looks at learning outcome data, that's not gender disaggregated. We're not getting the information of whether the learning outcomes of boys and girls are different. Also with this policy in SSA which was, one of the things that they did was they also looked at safety and mobility to address the gender gap. So a lot of states started distributing cycles and books to the girls, right, to ensure that they would actually get to school and that wouldn't be a reason why they wouldn't go. So that was an interesting example, but we also have to be a little bit mindful that now there's been, we're getting reports that there is reverse bias that's set in, where now you're seeing more boys drop out of school pre-COVID. Post, during COVID, numbers are quite stark, and we're starting to see data about girls, dropping out earlier, early marriage coming in again because it's cheaper, norm change, things like that. But pre-COVID, we were starting to see that boys were dropping out because so many girls were going to school and there was nobody at home and in the farm to help. So, those are things that I might be mindful as well when we're looking at the data in both ways. And that might have been an irreversible, but girls continue to get educated, perform well. But then what happens after them in 8th grade, right? When that RTE goes away, they don't continue on higher education because there aren't the higher schools or the secondary education schools left. Or now we're even seeing where those schools have been built, they don't go to college, for example. And how do you keep that trajectory on? And India is one of those countries which is legislatively very progressive in terms of most things. But if laws could change society and bring about gender equality, India would have been number one. The thing is that the normative and the behavioral cultural change that is required, just because we have a sexual harassment law doesn't mean that that'll stop. And just because we have, girls graduating top of their class doesn't mean they'll go to science or pursue engineering, even though they're doing so well. So I'm just saying, those are things that we need to look at when you're looking at mainstreaming as well.
Thank you, Nupur. I think you added some excellent points, and it's almost the perfect segue to talk a little bit more about the kind of role that cultural norms and biases play when it comes to allowing women to really see the benefits of development. Sima, I think your work has focused quite a bit on this, and we draw quite heavily from the research that you've conducted. And more recently, I think your work has also talked about how these barriers can affect women's participation and success in the labor market in developing countries. But India is one of those where our labor force participation rates continue to fall. And some of this could be a signal of deeply entrenched male favoring norms. So would love to hear from you on what the research tells us and how we can use that to sharpen the lens for programs and to inform policymaking.
Yeah, no, there couldn't have been a better segue than what Nupur was just saying, because I do think India is in a kind of unusual, or maybe North Africa is similar situation where in a lot of states there's really great female education. Secondary school completion rates are high. Young women are doing excellent on exams, but then there's a drop off at college, or there's certainly a big drop off in employment. And, and it does seem to be about norms of whether it's acceptable for women to work. It can be a penalty in the marriage market to have that college education, or say you want to work. And so how do you change what's in people's minds, et cetera. And so, kind of, I think a lot of what I've been thinking about is that how does that influence policy design in I guess, two broad ways. One is there are a lot of cases where we need to be thinking about those norms, because in addition to the sort of normal resources we would give to girls or women, we need to design those policies realizing those norms might be barriers. So I think the bicycle example is great. If we build schools and we try to encourage girls' education, we need to think about that transport, and the safety of the transport might be a bigger barrier in parents' minds. And similarly for adults, like having a safer metro or buses is important for women's employment. So towards this goal of women working, we need to think about a bunch of sectors to make that possible. So I think an example from my work is I've done some work with Save a Bank on business training, where they have microcredit clients who they're trying to improve their skills at running their small businesses. And just being able to attend that training at the Save a Bank site became a barrier for women in conservative communities where their work was mostly like home-based work. And so going to that site alone. And so, how do you then, we sort of just changed it so that women could come with someone else, a small tweak in that program that could make it more effective, in light of this barrier of women's mobility, or just the fact that they don't have a thick social network. So I think there are lots of cases where, if we are thinking about, we're going to provide women with skills or credit or any sort of resource, that might not work as well because of these norms, and we need to tweak it. So a nice example by Rohini Pandey and co-authors is about NREG's employment and wages from that, finding that one of the barriers to women participating or wanting to participate or getting as much out is that they wouldn't control the money once they earned it. And so just kind of in tandem, setting up bank accounts so that those in the women's name, so that the money was deposited in her name and she could have more control over it, that could make a difference in how successful. So some complementarities between, I think, different programs. And so that, cuts across like all sectors, and, norms is a big term. So there are lots of different social norms, but I think what we mean, what I think, when I think about that, I think kind of our standard vanilla program might not work because, women who have the human capital and the monetary capital to do something have to worry about what their community or their family is going to say they can and can't do. And so, sort of taking that as given, how can you redesign programs? And then there's a whole different part of my recent research, which is like, how do we change those norms? So, you want it to not be the case that if in a co-ed, in a non-segregated, gender segregated metro car, that women might be groped. Like, you want that to not become the norm. So, probably the research I'm most excited about recently has been this project with Breakthrough, working in schools to try to change what kids think is right and wrong, so that, boys are having to discuss and think about whether it's okay that boys and men get more resources for schooling, and, so that when they become young men in a few years, they'll be enthusiastic about their wives having careers. They'll want to help out more with childcare, et cetera. It's hard to change those norms. It's not a 5-year horizon to do it. But I think that's ultimately will make all sorts of other programming to help women easier if, there are a lot more people who are kind of cheering for that outcome of gender equality.
Thanks, Sima. I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to weigh in here.
So if I may, I just want to add, while we work on policy to change normative behavior, I also think there are gender biases that get built into when decisions are being made.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if you look at healthcare and the pharma industry, right? Most of the research goes into maternal health, like Ditaji was mentioning before, her ability to reproduce, whether it's contraception, whether it's pregnancy, nutrition, things like that. And when you look at mainstream healthcare or disease management, whether it's, heart disease, diabetes, depression, women are not part of those trials to actually test and experiment on how those medicines may be working on, because there is an inset bias around that. It could be when cars are being manufactured, for example, right? It's assumed that women don't drive, but it is the largest segment of individual buyers that's growing. So is your safety testing for automobile industry being done, taking into account that the driver is not a 6-foot, white male Caucasian, but could be an Asian woman driving? So are your seat belts being done like that? So I think that's the other bit that we need to fight. Like when you talk about even workforce diversity for most companies and their commitment to, my workforce will be 30% women. If you deep dive into that data, you'll see that most of those women sit in the HR department, or they may be in marketing, right? But they may not be in strategy or finance departments. We don't have many CFOs. So I think we have to look at it from both perspectives, where we are creating as well as where we are trying to make changes, and look at those segments. And often that behavioral change, it comes retrospectively. So I was having conversations with one of the larger FMGC companies about their advertising of those the washing machine, the washing powder, that product. And it took them 4 years more to come to India to show a man doing laundry and actually doing the washing when the woman comes back to work. They've used other forms of advertising where they show women are empowered, but they never were able to show that because it hit their bottom line. Their testing didn't allow them to, and they experimented this year. So I think those are critical factors when you look at, especially when you're looking at it from a private sector, which is driven by bottom line. So to build in that, and then data plays a big role in that. And the diversity of the stakeholder, the trial groups that you're working with.
Excellent points, Nupur. And I think what it really drives home is that these biases work at different levels to keep women inside, but also manifest in ways that make public and private spaces not necessarily the safest environments for a lot of women and girls. And I think I'd like to now sort of ask Deepta what the experience has been from the field, from the grassroots, because your work has been sort of inspirational when it comes to building institutions that have a feminist lens, that are female centered, but not just in their mission, but in also how they actually build capacity among women. So Khabar Lahariya is one that really comes to mind, Deepta, and would love to hear from you on what it takes to kind of build such movements that would center the needs of women while also simultaneously building their capacity, and what your approach has been to addressing the needs of various types of socioeconomic groups within these women, and not just socioeconomic. There could be religious, there could be caste dimensions. So would love to hear from you what that experience has been like.
So I think I have some learnings. I feel that social norm change is very popular today, but I think in many programs in India, women have done social norm change. And I think that it has happened when there are certain conditions that I have seen, whether it's a small group of women, which one has worked with very closely, like the Khabar Lahariya group, or whether it is larger programs like the Mahila Samakhya program. There's a lot of documentation on that program, which really saw women taking the lead in making norm change happen on a large scale. So I think it is, there are some key learnings from what made that possible in programs and also at the level of policy. One is that those programs really sought to create platforms for women to seek both information and engage in knowledge creation themselves. So these were not very prescriptive programs. At the policy level, they spoke broadly about empowering women. They didn't have a list of prescriptions like we see nowadays, where exactly to the T what is to be delivered, the outcomes is already handed out on a sheet to us and said, please go out there and implement. We've moved, in some ways, a step backwards in sort of implementing programs. While if you see even long associations or even Seva, their own journeys of having worked with women, that has been really, really important. So one is that it's not a short-term engagement. Inclusion takes time, it takes space, and you have to provide that in programs. You cannot think you're going to fix it. Social norms exist because certain structures exist. Social norms are pegged to that. So unless we don't understand those structural dimensions, we're not going to make social norm change happen. So I think creating platforms and programs that have seen themselves more as support structures, where they build the leadership of women or they build the leadership of girls, they build processes where girls and women can think for themselves, reflect on their reality, and look for solutions that they own and possess as their actions. So I think that is a really, really important learning that has been there. So building their self-confidence, building their self-image. And I think that these sort of core ideas then get embedded in local contexts. So when you work with what has been very, very exciting in terms of, looking at change and empowerment, where women and girls have been, and even communities have participated, is where there are multiple stakeholders. So it's not just rural women, it's also the Kasbah women who are engaging with them. It's also women who are researchers, women who are activists, and people who are from government and policy. So that lovely mix, I think, which happened in the 80s and 90s and up to 2000s also, is a fantastic mix, which actually generated a lot of insights on what gender mainstreaming is, what are the ways in which we can actually strengthen women, how women make norm change happen, or how girls start articulating what is important for them. So I think rather than us determining those criteria, I think programs that have worked on that level, and also programs and policies that have worked both at the level of the individual and the collective, because that is a very, very important space within it to make that happen. So I think that intersectional view only comes when there is a live and synergetic engagement between multiple kinds of stakeholders. So whether I'm working with Muslim women or girls, or whether I'm working with Dalit women or tribal women or even urban poor, their realities that they must be given time and space to reflect, learn, and get resources so that they can actually reflect on those realities is very, very, very critical to articulating the change. So if you see in the Mahila Samakhya program, it actually emerged differently. It was run in 10 states in India, but each state decided what its nature, context, how it was embedded, what issues the women wanted to take up, and how they wanted to negotiate change was very, very specific under the rubric of this larger thing. So I think we are in need for non-prescriptive, more open programs, which will really help women to be able to take their own decisions rather than the decisions being taken somewhere else.
Thank you, Dikta. I think you driven home the point that this process is long, is complex, and must come from the community. And therefore, support structures need to be designed around that. I think that's a good time to ask you, Nupur, how we can sort of set up partnerships across the stakeholder spectrum, whether it's civil society and government, whether it's the public, the private sector and the philanthropic space. How do we bring these stakeholders together to create an environment in which development programs like this can thrive? And how do we use existing policy frameworks such as gender budgeting to ensure that the momentum that is created on the ground can be sustained? I know UN Women is one of the architects of this, so would love to hear from you on how we can, what lessons are there to learn?
So there are no easy answers to this, Anna. We've been working on this for over 30 years now, and we've still not been able to crack it because the stakeholder interaction itself is quite complex, right? There are a lot of trust issues. There are competing priorities that come into play. But we are seeing more and more in policy making where women are coming at the forefront. The GRB is a good example of where most states have now started issuing gender budgets, right? For example, in Andhra Pradesh, this was one of the first years where a gender budget was actually tabled, in spite of the orders coming in much earlier. But at the same time, the concept of what a gender budget is and how does one create it also needs a lot of capacity building and thought process, right? It's not just about counting the number of women that have benefited from a government scheme, but putting them at the forefront. So if you see today in most of the flagship schemes, I would say close to 7, if I'm not mistaken, of the schemes put women at the front and center, whether that is the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, where they're giving housing to the poor, where the title has to be in the name of the woman, In case there is a man, he's the second title holder. Whether it's Swachh Bharat, which really helped build toilets for the safety of women, it's the yojana around providing gas connections instead of using firewood. It's now drinking water. Those are things that have direct benefit. Yes, these are in policy, and the implementation might not be at the best level that we would like. And there is still leakage in the systems, but it is the first time that we're seeing that women have become forefront as beneficiaries. One of the earlier decisions that was made was around the reservations for women in gram panchayats, right? 33% reservation, some states have up to 50%. But in very patriarchal states, we saw the concept of sarpanch patis, which was really that the mahila got the ticket, but it was the man who was running the show. And there has been studies that have shown in the first 3 years, the woman is the man is the one who's running the show. But as the woman starts learning, gets empowered, goes through the capacity building, starts taking over, and then the way the budgets for the gram panchayat are being spent changes from infrastructure to more social needs. Suddenly that water pump comes, the Anganwadi is given money, the Asha workers are empowered, the schools are functioning on time, the midday meals are delivered, So you see a drastic change, whereas when there is a man, you generally tend to see the road being built and, those kind of things. So one of the things we try to do is build capacities in as much as we can across sectors and create those sort of conversations. So right now, for example, under gender responsive procurement, right, it's primarily private sector driven. But if you look at the agri sector, it's still self-help group run. It's primarily driven by production in self-help groups when it comes to gender. So how do you create those linkages? How do you work with the state governments that are running and supporting those centers and connecting them to those market linkages and making sure it happens? If you look at Startup India, for example, it's it's not a scheme that is a gender. Nobody would call it a feminist or a gender scheme. Yet 40% of the startups under Startup India are women run. So how do you help them negotiate better? How do you work with the investors and say, you've got to invest in women entrepreneurs and businesses? How do you build that ecosystem? That's where it comes in. It's ultimately, I think, about capacity building and helping them talk to each other and speaking the same language, because often they are at cross purposes. I've also seen that civil society and the government right now, except for a few organizations like maybe Seva, which have a large imprint across the country, most civil society partners work in pockets locally, and they are also slower in implementation because of the nature of the work that they do. But politically and from a policy perspective, there's not much patience for that kind of work. So by nature of the way our country is run, the administration takes over, not giving the space for what Diptaji is saying, the time and the consensus building for that change. So I think that also needs to sort of change a little bit in terms of how do we match the timelines for delivery. So though that's what I would mention. And then data. Everything comes back to data. How do you account and say that this is actually what's achieved? Banking accounts, there's no gender data. It's a guess by the name, but it's not systemic, where the banks are catching whether it's a woman or not. It's the scheme. If it's a woman's scheme, they get the data, but you don't know how many non-women schemes there are women that have accessed it.
Thanks, Nupur. I think, lots of takeaways there, but one that continues, I think, is a thread that, that we require sort of sustained efforts on the ground, but also an enabling, supportive policy environment to be able to drive this normative, shift to make women the beneficiaries of development. I wonder if Sima, if you had any sort of thoughts around the gender quotas, and if you wanted to add anything on that front. I know we do have a few questions in the chat box as well, so we can also take those in a couple of minutes.
I'm happy to use the time for answer the
Great.
questions from the audience.
Great. So I think before we move into the audience Q&A, I maybe want to give us a minute to wrap up and sort of close the thoughts that we have around the broader sort of challenges of gender mainstreaming, but to identify what are the key lessons that we can take away, and what are the changes that we can make going forward, whether it's sort of being more systematic about collecting data, but are there other avenues that we are missing out on? Are there other areas that we need to prioritize and focus that have not been covered today, but perhaps need more investigation and dialogue? Would love to hear from you, maybe taking a minute to wrap up your thoughts, and then we can move into the questions. Sorry, maybe I'll start with you, Sima, and then I hand over to Nupur and Deepta.
I'm sure, I think as everybody's comments suggest, there's a lot that can be done, but we're still far from where we want to be. I think probably maybe the strongest tension in that's emerged here is, kind of we all agree that we somehow need to change social norms, but how do we go about that? How do we embrace what Deepta said about it has to come from women themselves or girls themselves kind of deciding what they want, but also kind of do it at something that's at scale. So this approach, I've talked about working in schools where sort of by its nature at scale you have to have some guidelines. But it reaches 600,000 kids a year. So kind of how do we balance that where every community is different, but with limited resources we want to do something at scale. I think that's just an interesting challenge that I'll take away from this to think, how do we, what are there creative ways to balance those?
Thank you, Sima. Deepta, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really think that there really needs to be a very strong cross-sectoral conversation for people who are working in the economic realm, because I think that is deeply in today's context, in this neoliberal world, in addition to, COVID, the economic realities and structures are really, really going to impact women. And then there is a whole world of social change, norm change, which I think is already happening in women's lives because life is changing. There's so many pressures. And I think that a lot of us also are sort of segregated in some people are working on livelihoods and economics and some are working on social change, norm change, etc. And I think that cross conversation really is very, very critical for us to take forward. If we really want to impact women's lives, I need to inform myself on the economics of women's lives, even if I'm working on the social dimension of their work. So I think for me, as researchers, as activists, as program people or policy people, we need to bring these two together and have that conversation. I think very important.
Thank you, Deepta. Nupur, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I agree absolutely with Sima and Deepta. I would just like to add SDG 5 on gender equality is the only one that is cross-cutting across all the 17 SDGs and has a vertical. And that by nature is what gender is about. So while we continue mainstreaming, I think we should not forget the need to continue focusing on gender as an individual requirement and group that we need to build capacities on. The other thing that we haven't really spoken about today is that we have an opportunity with emerging tech, AI, and big data that's come in. And how can we leapfrog in the gender equality by ensuring that our societal biases don't get inbuilt in those systems, which tomorrow will drive our choices. Ensure that Alexa that's being built is able to give women and men those equal choices and recommendations. Ensuring that when AI drives platforms that, provide recommendations to recruiters for, profiles for employees, women are selected as part of the leadership team for the, all of this stuff is going to get automated and run by technology. So I think that's a space that requires a lot more thinking. We need a lot more gender specialists that drive that, because your loan decision, your risk assessment, your investability, your ability to get a loan, life insurance, job, what education course, which university, will all be driven by these platforms. I think that's going to become also very important. And how do you build that capacity across those stakeholders to understand those sort of biases? Because most times these people don't think of gender in it. They'll be like, it's not a big deal, but it really is when you're driving and there's an accident and you need your car's voice control to hear and recognize your voice as a woman, and it won't do it because the AI behind it doesn't recognize a woman's voice accurately. So I think that's going to be a big thing that comes in the future as well.
Thank you, Nupur. I think there are some big challenges that have been outlined in terms of what we need to think about, whether it's thinking about scale, whether it's thinking about the cross-sectoral and the intersectional conversations that need to happen, and of course, thinking about big technology and the role that somehow some of these biases can carry into the newer sort of technological world that we are sort of slowly embracing. I think this gives us a lot of food for thought, but maybe we can take a step back to now answer some of the wonderful questions that our audience has sent in. So I can see one that maybe I'll direct to you, Sima, because it asks quite clearly, to what extent can policymakers employ the tool of incentives to increase the engagement of women in the labor market? So it would be great to hear from you on whether that does work, and what are the alternatives as well. And sorry, Sachrit Kaur asked this, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so there's a broad economists use incentives quite broadly. So, I think the example I mentioned earlier of women's wages being deposited in their own bank account so that they actually have more control over that money, and is increasing women's incentive to work. So if you're working but you don't get to say much about how that money is going, what your priorities aren't being respected, then you don't have a personal incentive to work. And so that's one way. I think in terms of like kind of financial incentives, if that's what you had in mind. I mean, in some ways, wages, employee salaries are the financial incentive. So I don't think, my own sense, at least in India, is not that kind of like, women are, it's their own choice not to work. And if their salary were 10% higher, they would work, which is kind of what a financial incentive does. So I think, that I'll interpret it more broadly to say, we either need to kind of get families and to make them see the incentives, see the benefits, or for women kind of, really tie your own work to your own values, then getting more say in, your house or your community.
Thanks, Sima.
Can I add to that?
Please.
Yeah, I just want to add the other type of incentive that we can look at is people who are investing in the women or in the sector. So the MFI, the microfinance organizations learned very early on that the NPAs from women loanees was much lower than a man. And also that women tend to use the loans given to them for the purpose which they use, they take the loan for, and create more economic value than maybe a man who's taking the money, who may blow it off on other things. So I think that learning and creating awareness around that, there's also some research and data around women-run entrepreneurs tend to have a higher rate of return, less risk of failure because of the way they run their organization than a male, and yet they get valued at lower, levels. So because of the social biases, right? Like I've heard investors who've said, oh, but are you going to get married and have a baby? What will happen to my investment? And that's a notional sort of bias that does not necessarily have a realistic impact on her ability to run the company. So I think that's the other set of incentives we need to work on, is in the financial sector of who are making those investments in the self-help groups, in the women entrepreneurs, in the businesses, companies that have diverse supply chains have diverse workforce, have higher rates of return. There is lots of data that has now come across from that. There are companies that are better performing financially. So those are reasons why you would want to invest in them as well, right? And as a consumer, want to buy from them as well. So I think those are other soft incentives that we can look at beyond just what the woman earns.
Thank you. I think there's an excellent point there that the incentives perhaps need to be reframed and redirected towards the other stakeholders to make them really see value in what women bring to the workforce. There's so many great questions, but perhaps I will take one that Sima briefly touched upon in her closing remarks, but I'll also open it up to the panel to weigh in. This one is by Apurva Guditi, who asks, how can we find the balance between the scalability of programs and contextualizing programs so that they address the more nuanced challenges that minority or smaller, more marginalized communities might face? So I'll throw it open to the panel in case you want to take a shot at it.
I can respond.
Yes, please, Ditna.
I think that we need to, there is a real push today for scalability. It's very desired and it's important. And I think in terms of provisioning by state, so in terms of making schools available, public health facilities available across the board, I think those are very, very important, critical things that I think are emerging also post-COVID for us. And as Nupur also mentioned that, the implications of health for women are not just maternal mortality, but also in terms of the public health dimension of health also, whether it's tuberculosis, malaria, food, nutrition, all of these affect women and girls in specific kinds of ways and poorer communities in specific kind of ways. So I think that scaling is really important, but I think that there is, and I don't know how much we have learned actually from the really wonderful, fantastic, smaller experiences and the innovations. So I think that is the skill of policy making, is what the learning of a program really is, and then how does it get scaled up? What of that dimension can be scaled up? Because often what we're doing is we are trying to mirror that program in different contexts. It doesn't work. We've also seen that. So I think it's the pulling out of the key learnings of a smaller, innovative experience, which also I think today needs to be nurtured. Because I think that we are no longer in the development sector, we are looking at scale and prioritizing it. And in a sense, people have said, like enough of intensive work, now we need to think across. But I think that these are very, very, for instance, at the beginning, somebody talked about education. So in 2008, when we were reviewing and went to Assam, the reality was that a lot of boys were dropping out at 11 and 12 years of age because they go to labor and they are apprenticing, across the board. So when we are understanding gender, we need to look at both what is happening to young boys and girls to actually address the issue of gender and the hard labor that young boys are also put to in certain communities, or even amongst Muslim women. I mean, this we knew in 2004 and 5 that girls are, completing till class 10 also, Muslim girls, more than Muslim boys, because they are training in particular skills. So I think that we need, India is a very diverse country, regionally, caste, class-wise. So we need to situate it. And yet we need to pull out certain sort of learnings to be able to apply it as something. What are those which are desired at the policy level? And I think one size, particularly where gender is concerned, because gender is embedded so deeply in all of these structures of caste and class and community and region. And, so I think, actually, I believe that actually to do work on gender is the most complex thing. Because as Nupur said, it's the vertical, it's cutting across everything. And it is impacting those things and it being impacted by those structures. So it's a very complex thing to understand. And I think that often we just look at gender in one dimensional. And now we are facing a new issue, which is that gender has become politicized in a new kind of way, which is when you talk about trans groups, LGBTQI, different identities within gendered identities are also becoming a very, very important issue. Their employment, their location in the workspace, what opportunities, their economic condition. So I think that we are also at the cusp of a very important change that has happened in the last 10 years. It's not, gender is just not about women only in the way that some of us worked on it in the 80s and 90s. There are just new voices and new groups that are coming up. And we do need to take that into account when we are talking about gender mainstream. Yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you so much. I think that's actually an excellent sort of space and a point to maybe wrap up our discussion on. I think there's a lot more fantastic questions, and some of these have been answered by researchers within the JPAL network and outside. So we're happy to send a few resources across to some of the questions in the chat box. But I think the point that Deepta made about gender not necessarily being looked at as the dimension of just women, but looking at women and the intersection with age, with disability, within the caste and socio-economic identities that they have within sexual orientation, I think is the new sort of realm that gender mainstreaming needs to focus on and consider. And I think the key takeaway for me is that gender mainstreaming is not an end goal, but it's a process. So this idea will keep evolving as women and their needs do, and perhaps we will revisit this conversation a few years down the line with more nuances and more kind of ideas to discuss. On this note, I know I'm a little bit over time, but I want to thank all the panelists for their time today, for raising such pertinent questions, for highlighting such important challenges, and for charting out that it's not an easy ride, and whoever's in it is here with a complex and a complicated set of problems to address. So thank you so much. I will hand back to Pranati to wrap us up and to let us know what the next steps are.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anna. A huge thank you to all our panelists for this extremely enriching discussion, and a much needed one at that. Thank you so much for taking out the time and that one evening to enlighten us through the various nuances that you pointed out. Two quick announcements from our end. On behalf of Belong, I'm excited to share that another spelled UNOTHER, which is Belong's short format literary content mobile app focusing on diversity and inclusion, especially for South Asian audiences, is now live on Google Play Store. And you can download the app to get to know more about high quality book summaries, interviews, local reading groups, etc., which are based around very similar conversations around intersectionality and inclusion. And we will soon be launching features such as events, podcasts, and we do invite you all to take a look, considering that this seems to be a common area of interest. The second thing that I really wanted to point out today is that we've had a wonderful set of sessions today. We have one more coming up at 8:30 p.m. on the same link, which is around how we can make education programs more inclusive. So please do join us for that. It's an hour-long session, which is being moderated by Dayong Lee, who is an associate partner at Dalberg Advisors. So please do join in for that. And tomorrow as well, we have a whole host of exciting sessions lined up. Our session at 2 o'clock, which goes on to 3:30, is being co-hosted by the wonderful team at JPAL South Asia, which is focusing on a research showcase titled xSDG Research Showcase, Identifying and Mitigating Prejudice, where we'll be joined by 10 researchers from across the globe who are doing some path-breakingly intersectional research. Our second session for tomorrow will be at 5 p.m., which will go on till 7 p.m., which will be around how global WASH programs can be made more inclusive. Apologies, the session starts at 4:30 p.m. Tomorrow, about how global WASH programs can be made more inclusive. So please do join in for that as well. Thank you so much for joining in again, and we look forward to having you with us. I will be posting the registration link and the details for the upcoming schedule in the chat box below, so please feel free to check that out. Thank you and have a great evening ahead.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.